We're live now, so I've got to start behaving. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hampton History Museum and our Port Hampton Lecture Series. I'm Alan Holman. I'm the curator here at the Hampton History Museum, and we're so glad to see you live again. Want to start the evening off by making a couple of announcements and draw your attention to some programming we've got coming up. Beyond tonight's lecture, we have on Wednesday, July 20th at 6 o'clock, our Front Porch Music Series. How many of you have been to our Front Porch Music Series? That's great. So you all know what that's about. We have in this room live concerts. We try to focus in on the traditional music forms. So on Wednesday the 20th, Bill Jenkins and the Virginia Mountain Boys are a kind of traditional bluegrass band. Old-timey music, they called it where I grew up, even though old-timey meant it was invented in the 1940s and 50s. So please come back. That would be next week, next Wednesday. And singer, songwriter, and cross-picking guitar virtuoso Bill Jenkins, member of the Virginia Musical Museum Hall of Fame, and his string band, the Virginia Mountain Boys, bring to life the authentic music of the Southern Appalachian Mountains, including early bluegrass ballads and camp meeting songs in a style that is uniquely their own. This old-time music is a reflection of the lives of the early immigrants and their descendants who eked out a meager living in the hills and hollows of those majestic mountains, heavily influenced by Scots-Irish and African rhythms. It later gave birth to the early bluegrass and to many early country songs which you will hear in this era-spanning show next Wednesday. You can probably hear it in my voice. I grew up in the mountains. I'm a hillbilly, and I claim it proudly. I can't get rid of the accent. It's a wonderful thing. Also, on Saturdays this month, we're having Splash of the Arts. Hampton City Schools is collaborating with young audiences of Virginia, and we have young people presenting various artistic endeavors here at the museum. So between 10 and 4 o'clock on Saturdays this month, except this coming Saturday they'll be at Mill Point Park, but it will be our event we're sponsoring there. So please feel free to come back the rest of this month on Saturday afternoon and see these wonderful kids do a wonderful job teaching us how to understand the arts. Our exhibits, our upstairs gallery, which is the Bayshore Historic Black Beaches exhibit, is open through September. So you've got a couple more months if you've not been to see it yet. So please come back and visit that, or if you've seen it, come back and visit it again. 1st of October it goes down, and we're working on finding a replacement for it. We're not going to develop an in-house exhibit that quickly. So those are the things that are coming up there. So we're just glad that we are alive and doing things again here. But tonight we have Carolyn Heaps-Pecaro, who's the Resiliency Officer for the City of Hampton. Through her work, Carolyn coordinates the interdisciplinary multi-departmental team that advances the Resilient Hampton Initiative. Prior to joining the City of Hampton, Carolyn worked to support multiple climate resilience and adaptation initiatives in her professional and academic life at the University of Virginia. Carolyn.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to see you. I recognize some of you are new faces, but I'm really excited, and thanks to the History Museum for inviting me to participate in this series, and thank you to you all for coming out and taking some time out of your evening to listen to what I have to share tonight. So as Alan said, my name is Carolyn Heaps-Pecaro. I'm the city's Resiliency Officer, so I do work for the City of Hampton. And this evening, I've got three main topics that I wanted to cover after doing some background and context setting. So we'll talk about climate change and sea level rise in Hampton, and then I'm excited about this because I don't often get the opportunity to present without a very specific agenda for community feedback or engagement. And I'm here tonight to really share just what it is we're doing and why we're doing it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about theory, which I don't often do, but I hope you all will enjoy that and get something out of it. And then I'm going to talk about Resilient Hampton, our ongoing work, some of what you've seen already in the pamphlet and the flyer that I have here with me tonight. And then, of course, we will save some time for a Q&A at the end. I do want to acknowledge I am not a climate scientist. I am really focused on applying that science to our work here in the city. So I recognize some of you might be affiliated with NASA or know more about science than I do, and I hope we can have a robust conversation at the end. If any of you have anything to add, please don't hesitate to speak up. So I want to start here by setting a little bit of context. So who are we in Hampton? What is Hampton as a community? This whole lecture series is about Hampton and the waterfront. So it must mean something that we are this coastal community and that we've been here for 400 years. So this is our city's strategic vision set by City Council. And I like to share it because I think it's a good perspective setting for this conversation of thinking about our vision for the future and how that can be informed by not only where we're based on the coast, but also our history. So to get a feel for who all is actually in the room here, I want to do a little show of hands for those in person. I'm sorry if you're watching remotely, I can't see you. But if you are a resident of Hampton, can you please raise your hand? And we're going to do a kind of process of elimination. So if you have lived in Hampton for more than 5 years, keep your hand up. More than 10 years? 20 years? 30 years? 40? Wow, okay. Over here, can I ask you, ma'am, as somebody who's lived in Hampton for a long time, when you think about our water, our assets of water, what do you think about in Hampton?
I think it's beautiful and relaxing. It's an opportunity to go to the beaches.
Mm-hmm.
And when I went away to school, and then you realize I should take advantage of that.
Sure, yeah, so it's beautiful, relaxing. There's an opportunity to take advantage of the beaches, and when you leave, you miss it, and you want to come back and take advantage of that. What about anybody else? Do you have any perspectives on what it means to be this waterfront community?
Been here a long time. Lived at Bayshore Beach on the water. Now I'm at the end of the Hampton River. And I appreciate the waterfront here. It's beautiful.
Yeah. So another resident who's lived at Buckrow a long time and now lives on the Hampton River and just appreciates the beauty of being on the water. Thank you. Okay. Well, I like to get a sense of who's in the room, but also, how we think about water, because we are, like I said, that coastal community, and we really rely on the water as an asset for a lot of different things about our identity. So recreation, getting out to enjoy the water, like things that you both have just shared about the beach. Industry, so this is actually a picture from the seafood aquaculture research that happens from Virginia Tech here in the city. We've got our pirate festival, parts of our culture tied to that coastal identity. And then, of course, our beautiful environment. And this is an image that I took at Grandview Nature Preserve. It's just beautiful out there. And over time, we are a coastal community, but also increasingly urban, right? So things have changed from when this map was drawn by Captain John Smith in the 1620s. This is of the whole Chesapeake Bay, but you can tell that obviously when European colonists first arrived, we had a lot more forests and a lot less development, of course, than we do today. And we've seen that change over time. Even 400 years later, we had a good amount of farmland, or 300 years later, a good amount of farmland, but over time that became increasingly suburban, right? So this is the 1960, and for those who can't quite picture, Newmarket Creek is what runs kind of right through the middle of our city. So we can see here that that kind of farmland has transitioned to more patterns of suburban development, like in lots of places around the country. And then, of course, increasingly urban. This aerial photo from almost 10 years ago now, highlights that amount of development that has really occurred around Coliseum, Central, and Mercury Boulevard. So I share all of this not because it is important in the context. When we think about climate change and sea level rise, it isn't just about the natural environment. It's about the ways in which that change is interacting with our physical environment and where we live and how we built our city. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about climate change, do somewhat of a mini science lesson. I apologize if it's remedial for some of you who are familiar with this already. But at the most basic level, when we talk about climate change, we're really referring back to the greenhouse gas effect. So we know this is a natural process that we need to be able to survive, right? If we didn't have it, the Earth would not be habitable by humans. And so we see this process where solar radiation is sent from the sun to Earth, and some of that is absorbed, most of it is absorbed, some of it bounces back. Some of what bounces back gets trapped in our atmosphere, and that is in turn kind of re-emitted by these gases that make up our atmosphere, the greenhouse gases that we have in our atmosphere. And this typically is not an issue, or historically has not been an issue. The challenge is then when we have increasing rates of greenhouse gas emissions and we have more of that greenhouse gas effect happening because we have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So most notably, of course, is carbon dioxide. And we can see this graph showing the increases in emissions since 1900, or past century plus of time. So this will probably look familiar to a lot of you. What this looks like, or how this is generated in the United States presently, is primarily from transportation. So that is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States as of 2 years ago in 2020. So that's all of the fossil fuels that we burn for our cars, our trucks, our ships, our boats, et cetera. And then, of course, electricity generation, so burning coal or natural gas for our electric grid. That, of course, means, like I mentioned previously, more heat being trapped in the atmosphere and leading to globally higher average temperatures. So this is showing just deviations from normal, what we've seen as historically normal in the recent past, so the recent past of when we've been tracking these temperatures for humans on this planet. We know that it's increased, globally temperatures have increased by average of about 1 degree Celsius since 1880, and 9 of the 10 hottest years on record have occurred in the past decade. So that matters not just because it's getting hotter, so we're seeing more extreme heat days, more heat in general, but it also matters because it has these other impacts on our environment. So of course I'm here today to talk about sea level rise and how that's impacting us. But also it leads to changes in precipitation patterns and changes in powerful storm events. So we're seeing an increase and a projected continued increase in more powerful storm events, and then also more intense and frequent rainfall. So these changes interact with each other. You can imagine as a very flat community that has a lot of impervious surface, so surfaces that water can't infiltrate into, and a high groundwater table, we get this challenge of higher sea levels in addition to more rainfall is just more water overall in our environment that leads to more flooding. So digging a little bit farther into this question of higher global average temperatures and sea level rise, how are those two things connected? Well, there's two main components that I want to highlight that are shown in this image. Firstly, as water gets warmer, it takes up more space through thermal expansion. So that's shown kind of right in the middle there. But then additionally, we're seeing more formerly land-based ice melting and entering our ocean, our global ocean. And so as a result of that, we just have more water in our oceans. And when that happens, we have more volume of water to deal with. But this is also, of course, many of you will know, this is experienced locally at different rates because of subsidence. So we've got this issue here, or reality here in Hampton Res, that our land is sinking as a result of mostly adjustment from former areas where there used to be glaciers. There are no longer. The land is now bouncing back, but also removing of water tables, and so water from our aquifers. So the combination of these two things leads to the issue of relative sea level, and that's why you'll often hear Hampton referred to as having a higher rate of sea level rise than other places around the globe and other places in the United States, along with New Orleans, for example. And I mentioned before, this is just to illustrate that kind of interaction again between storm events and sea level rise. So as we see storm events continuing to occur, we also have just the base level of water being higher. So when you've got these conditions, as you see in this one of the things highlighted here, over under this storm surges, you'll see surface and deep ocean circulation changes, storm surges. So that's another condition driving sea levels at the local level. And when we've got that happening, in addition to just more water overall, that leads to higher storm surges. So you can see on the bottom the base blues rising along with increasing storm surges over time. So if we look at a map of Hampton, this is kind of current picture of flood conditions. So these are current floodplains. The areas that are darkest blue are areas that are most often inundated, with the darkest blue being mean low water, so pretty much always underwater. The lightest kind of bluish green color is the 0.2% annual flood risk, or the 500-year storm area. So this is what it currently looks like. You'll see that kind of gradation of space, particularly up in the Grandview, Fox Hill area. We know that that's an area that floods more frequently, right? This is what scientists project us to see by the year 2080. So this is about 60 years from now in the anticipated greenhouse gas emissions scenario. Now, I do want to say there is a level of uncertainty around these projections. So this is one picture. It may or may not come to pass, but this is based on the best available science that we have now without any shoreline protection projects. So this is what it would look like if we kind of did nothing in terms of shoreline protection. So we can see, obviously, that mean low water area expanding. Most of Grandview Nature Preserve would be permanently inundated, pretty much. And much of the downtown area would be, where we're sitting now, would be subject to a 50% annual chance of flooding. So, you know, this is a picture I took in May of a street near me that was flooded. I don't know if some of you remember that kind of high tides that we were experiencing back in May. The way that we'll really experience these impacts is kind of slowly at first in terms of the chronic stresses. We'll see, you know, particularly when we have those lunar cycles that align with higher tides in spring and fall, we'll see these king tides becoming more and more of a nuisance to our daily life. And then, of course, those extreme events too, but on a day-to-day basis, this is really what we can kind of continue to expect. So what I'm trying to convey is that I think we can expect familiar challenges to become worse and more unpredictable in terms of flooding, in terms of wave action, wind damage, heat exposure, et cetera. And these all matter in terms of not just their static impacts, but also how they interact with our built environment and how we've built our city. So that is kind of doom and gloom, right? But this is not hopeless, and I'm not hopeless about this challenge, and neither should you be. I am inherently an optimist. I think that pretty much everybody who does climate adaptation work is, or they wouldn't care enough to do this work. We know that the Earth has gone through some pretty extreme climate changes in the past, right? Like I was at the aquarium this past weekend, and they were talking about how in the very ancient past, sea levels in Virginia used to be 450 feet higher than they were, or lower than they were. I can't remember which it was, but the point is things have changed and they will continue to change. It really matters now, what do we do about it? How do we respond and how do we take action? So this is the theory part that I hope you all bear with me through some of this, thinking about resilience, why resilience matters and how it can be a tool for addressing this challenge. So we've got kind of generally, in general terms in systems, resilience is really talking about, as you can see, withstanding major disruptions and recovering from them. There's been a lot of thinking about how this applies to urban systems more specifically, like Hampton. And it's those kind of scholars have thought about it not just in terms of returning to a previous state in the face of disturbance, but also how we might adapt and change and or quickly transform those systems to be different and better adapted into the future, particularly in the kind of face of climate change. This is a lot of what people think about when they think about resilience as climate change. So resilience is really defined as the parts of the system, the parts of that, the kind of attributes of that system that allow it to perpetuate into the future. And so these are some of the things that people talk about when they talk about resilience. It's redundancy, flexibility, robustness, diversity, et cetera. And so these different attributes, we can think about how to apply them in that urban system in order to achieve resilience and allow our kind of urban system to perpetuate in the face of climate change. I want to highlight that I think there's often some confusion or the tendency to conflate sustainability and resilience. They are distinct topics. especially in the highly theoretical space. So resilience is really about the system's attributes and how it in itself can be able to perpetuate into the future, whereas sustainability is really thinking about how can the system operate within all of those external factors that matter to its ability to continue. And so they really should be working together, but they're inherently not the same thing. And I say that because resilience is not necessarily good or bad. We can have systems of racist oppression that are highly resilient. That doesn't mean that they are desirable. That's just something that we want to change, and it's more difficult to do so because it is resilient. So to mutually reinforce sustainability, create a system on values, we need to kind of decide what we want that system to look like. What do we want the future to look like? What do we want our community to be into the future? Once we define that, and maybe that's a sustainable city, an equitable city, then we can work to build in those attributes of resilience that I showed on the past slide as we build that system, that resilient system. So we need to ask ourselves some key questions as we're working to build resilience. Is our state of the systems, is the state of Hampton, our systems, is it desirable? To whom? For whom? Who gets to decide the answers to those questions? And then in the face of what disturbances do we want that system to perpetuate? And this, I don't want to linger too long on this one in particular. It's kind of a different way of thinking about vulnerability, of course, and resilience. But this kind of gets to the point of that question. When we ask these questions, we know that not everybody experiences the impacts of natural hazards and will not experience impacts of climate change the same. Being exposed to a threat is one aspect of being vulnerable, but also we need to think about who's more sensitive. So if you have a neighbor, think about your neighbors who maybe rely on electricity to keep their medicines cold, and are they more sensitive during a hurricane to the loss of power than perhaps you are, perhaps other neighbors are? So we need to think about all of these components as we decide the answers to those questions of, what are we responding to and how are we building this for whom? We have limited resources, so we need to prioritize this work. And that gets back to this question of equity and not just what our city looks like, but who lives in our city and where they're located and what support they need. So this map is showing Census Bureau data, showing % of the population living in poverty across the city by census tract. So it gives someone a picture of, we don't have the same amount of income, we don't have the same poverty levels across the whole city. So this is a question I posed as I was developing the overview of this presentation, is can we be active participants in shaping how we experience sea level rise? And I think we can. Based on all of that theory I just shared, we need to think about what we want the future to look like and how we can make it sustainable. And then we need to work to achieve that system while building in those elements of flexibility, redundancy, and robustness. So we should be thinking about what other challenges we face as a city that we want to address. And maybe it's thinking about something like transportation. Do we want to continue to rely heavily on single occupancy vehicles, or do we maybe want to invest in public transportation and bicycle infrastructure, for example, pedestrian infrastructure? Economic corridors. Do we want to create more dense economic space, less expansive parking lots perhaps, and make the area more hospitable to pedestrians? Do we want to transform our residential areas to create more kind of native habitat and ecosystems and accommodate stormwater a little bit better in our infrastructure? Do we want to activate our waterfront park spaces and foster more diverse uses there? And do we want to think about more thriving ecosystems on our shorelines and helping to reduce shoreline erosion while also building back some of those communities of seagrasses and oysters and so forth? So beyond these, there are also all of the economic and social changes that we might want to see that are more difficult to visualize. So I haven't created images of them, but you can imagine what some of those changes might look like as well. So this is where the Resilient Hampton Initiative comes in. We are here as a coastal, urban, historic city facing this huge challenge that I outlined at the beginning, right? Specifically sea level rise. And we need to define how we want to thrive into the future and what we want our system to look like in order to make it more resilient to that challenge. And so this is where the initiative was born from. This is our mission, to live with water, and really we're committing to embracing a future where we're connecting with water while learning to adapt to those impacts that we're expecting to experience and already experiencing in some cases. But how did we get here? It really started back in 2011. Some of you might know that the city published a comprehensive waterways management plan in that year, and then a couple of years later participated in the Dutch Dialogues Virginia process, where we began rethinking our relationship with water to address flooding with this resilience in mind. So you'll see that we really focused here on systems approaches, working at multiple scales, thinking both about the current and also the future, and setting a big vision while also embracing small actions. Inspired by that kind of process and thinking from the Dutch, we developed a Living with Water plan framework that serves as our guiding principles, and then began a series of water plans which set more specific projects and ideas for what that looks like applied in space. So these are our 3 major plan documents that we've created so far. You've also received this, or may have picked up this handout that talks about our ongoing planning effort for downtown Phoebus and Buckrow. That is our next plan. And overall, this is our approach. So it's about both addressing that challenge of flooding and sea level rise, reducing that vulnerability, while also recognizing and treating water as assets. And this on the right is the city's definition of resilience. Everybody defines resilience slightly differently, so I like to share it there. And this, again, this is getting back to what I was saying earlier, that it's important we need to define what the future looks like and what our vision is. And this values-driven framework comes directly from that first framework document that we've developed, and was really built on a community engagement process where we went out and we asked the community what it is that they really care about and what they want to see happen through this work. And this is what we heard, and this is what we're working to integrate into this effort. We have 8 major goals, and I want to highlight here that we also cannot do this work alone. I say this every time I present, so some of you may have heard it before, but it's really important to the success of the initiative, the robustness, for example, to work at multiple scales and to integrate this throughout not just efforts that the city is doing, but connecting with our partners and things that are happening at the state and regional and even national level in order to make this work more effective. But then also relying on the actions of individuals, of neighborhood groups, of communities who take action themselves. So the city has a certain very specific role to play, but there's also actions for businesses, for residents, and for everybody in this community to take. So what do we do? I think I often go through like, what are our goals and our values? But people ask, okay, well, what do you actually do? So we create those plans that I was talking about that kind of outline our future for living and thriving with water. But those plans result in projects. So those water plans, watershed level plans, identify specific projects that we want to implement to create that vision for the city that we've established. And then we also do community engagement. We work to create a movement for the whole community to be informed, to take action for resilience. In terms of the water plans, just a little bit more specifics. So we have completed our water plan for Newmarket Creek and are now, as I mentioned, working on downtown Phoebus and Buckrow. And of course, that's not the whole city. We have more work to do, and we have committed to doing water plans for the entire city over the coming years. So in these water plans, we take these different layers of the landscape, physical, social, and then look at not just the natural environment, but also the built environment and our systems on top of that. We work with the community through an engaged process to establish a vision for what that looks like, what are the values, and then identify and present those projects. So to give you some concrete examples, this is what came out of our Newmarket Creek plan. These are 3 pilot projects, and you can see in this light pink color the outline of that watershed area. We actually came up with more than 20 projects that were proposed in that plan, and the first 3 were identified for their replicability, their outputs. Really, we were focused on creating some measurable impacts that we wanted to be able to track, and so we looked for projects that could help us accomplish that, and things that we could do within about 5 years time span. So Big Bethel Blueway, North Armistead Avenue, and Lake Hampton. Some of you might have heard of those. I'm going to talk about just a couple of those quickly, just with some images. So this is Big Bethel Blueway. This is an existing drainage canal that exists over in the New Market Creek watershed. It's kind of very close to the Newport News border. On the right-hand side, you can see the former Mallory School. So it's a former school site there with the ball fields. And so with this project, we're taking that existing canal and transforming it into more activated space. So we heard from the community values for more opportunities for pedestrian safety and pedestrian bicycle use. We heard, obviously, an interest in reducing flooding, also this commitment to creating better natural systems. So through this project, we're installing a series of these weirs, or kind of low dams, over the body of the canal to help hold back some of the water in the canal space during rain events, and therefore reduce the amount of flooding that would happen downstream. So rather than letting all of that water flow as quickly as it can down that canal to New Market Creek, a little bit farther south than this, we're holding some of it back to hopefully reduce some of that flooding. Then here we've got North Armistead Avenue. This is our project here, so you can imagine kind of just behind us is Lake Hampton, kind of over that direction, if you're familiar with that area. It's close to the Home Depot. We are taking this roadway that is, as some of you may know, currently experiences regular flooding during tidal events, and elevating it as much as 5 3/4 feet in some spaces, but for the most part, less than that. And then in addition to that, we're also adding these sidewalks and multi-use trails, and also adding some more opportunities for retaining water in the landscape and native habitat through just, pretty minimal amounts of species insulation, but something is better than nothing. So this is an example of another project that is helping to address sea level rise by elevating that roadway higher than we expect sea levels to rise in the next 50 years, lifespan of this project, and adding more co-benefits through the walking and biking trails. So I'm just about wrapped up, but I wanted to, as we're finishing, return back to this strategic vision and highlight that we all have a role to play in shaping the resilient community that we want to see. One of the most important ways that I think you can take action is by, firstly, being educated. So thank you for coming tonight. I think that's a great first step. And then secondly, being an active citizen in planning efforts. So getting involved in work that is happening, and sharing your thoughts on our vision and what our community should look like, but also then coming back out, holding the government, holding me, holding my team accountable for actually accomplishing those plans that we put into writing. As we wrap up, I wanted to share a quote from one of my favorite op-ed articles from a couple years ago. It was called "How to Stop Freaking Out and Tackle Climate Change." And the quote is long, so I hope you enjoy it. Imagine dense but livable cities veined with public transit and leafy parks, infrastructure humming away to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, fake meat that tastes better than the real thing, species recovering and rewilding the world, the rivers silver with fish, the skies musical with flocking birds. This is a future where the economic inequality, racism, and colonialism that made decades of inaction on climate change possible has been acknowledged and is being addressed. It is a time of healing. Many ecosystems have changed, but natural resilience and thoughtful human assistance is preventing most species from going extinct. This is a future in which children don't need to take to the streets in protest and alarm because their parents and grandparents took action. Instead, they are climbing the trees. This future is still possible, but it will only come to pass if we shed our shame, stop focusing on ourselves, join together, and demand it. So that was Emma Maris writing for the New York Times. So this is my call to action. Please take one of the handouts that I have distributed over to the side over here. Come back out to our events. There is a QR code, I think, on this little handout that will give you a link to the newsletter. Sign up for the newsletter. We publish that every month, just once a month, so it won't spam your inbox, and we'll give information on work that's ongoing and upcoming. I also encourage you all to get involved in the Hampton Community Plan. We're developing both a 5-year plan on kind of immediate strategic issues and then a longer 20-year plan, which is, of course, really important for thinking about big changes like sea level rise and climate change. So you can get involved in thinking about what the future should look like through that process as well. And there will be opportunities to sign up to be part of the next phase up on the website, hampton.gov/Hampton2040 next week. And then you can also sign up for the city's general e-news alerts to get information on other upcoming events to be involved, like surveys and meetings and focus groups. So that is all I have for you. I would love to take any questions or comments. Let's start here. Thank you.
So in your planning, ongoing, how often does the words seawall either enter the discussion or maybe not at all?
Yeah, I think, you know, should I repeat the questions, Alan?
You know what? I am going to.
You're going to facilitate?
The mic. And the reason we're doing it this way is because we are live and we want folks to hear the questions. So.
Just to repeat, so in your planning process, which I assume is still ongoing, I get that sense, how often does the term seawall come up, or maybe not at all?
Yeah. So to answer the question, yes, it has come up, and I think it will continue to come up more often. You know, we started with the New Market Creek watershed, which is a particular part of the city, if you can imagine it shown on that map there. Maybe less of an area for seawall than some of the other areas that need planning moving forward. So as we're looking at the downtown Phoebus and Buckler water plan, it has come up, and I expect it will continue to come up as a solution for especially our really coastal areas, not just on the riverfront with New Market Creek, but as we look to Buckrow Beach and even the Hampton River in some areas around downtown, there has been discussions about that. So I should say, you know, some of the solutions that I've given are fairly rosy, and I don't mean to be dismissive of the very difficult decisions that we will need to make as a community moving forward, because they will be difficult. Looking back at that map of inundation in 2080, we saw huge areas of the city that were going to be flooded very regularly, if not completely inundated, and that is a huge challenge that will not come without grief and difficulty in deciding how to live in the future. And I do recognize that, and I think while we can be optimistic, we also have to acknowledge that some difficult decisions will need to be made and trade-offs.
I haven't heard anything about the budget or the cost of the future. Or, you know, what are you paying? You know, what does it cost now to do what you're doing? You talk about that? Yeah,
sure. So in terms of I'll give numbers for a couple of the projects that I pulled up here. So for North Armistead Avenue, that road racing project will cost us more than $20 million to complete in total. The Big Bethel Blueway, I think, is on the order of $13 million, all said and done. So it's per project quite expensive. I think there are some things that we need to do as a city that are more policy oriented, like addressing land use and zoning, which the cost to the city of that is lower to rewrite our policies. But the impact can be quite great of changing some of that in the long term. So it is expensive. It is a huge cost. I don't have data on the overall economic impact of climate change versus the cost of some of these interventions, which that is a goal for me to develop that as a city. And there has been a lot of research on that topic.
It looks like this is really a regional problem. Does Newport News, Pocosin, Langley Air Force Base, York County have a similar plan going, and you'll coordinate with them so the water won't flow around the corner?
Yes to Langley. We work really closely with Langley. Actually, they're one of our best partners. They worked with us to develop a joint land use study addendum to think about resiliency in particular. Collaborating with the other cities has been more of a challenge. I think that Newport News is just starting their resiliency planning effort, so they got funding from the state to do a climate action, so thinking about mitigating climate change and reducing greenhouse gases and doing climate adaptation, so thinking about sea level rise and precipitation. They just got money to do both of that, and so I've been really, with hope growing that they will partner with us increasingly on some of this work. I think the challenge, though, is that some of these other communities, Pocosin in particular, for example, just have less resources. And so I think Hampton is fairly lucky in that we're pretty well positioned from resourcing standpoint, and to hire consultants and to hire staff to be able to do this work, whereas a lot of other really rural communities throughout the United States, including here closer to home, don't have those same resources. So I think the state is working really hard to create a statewide master plan. Actually, they have created a statewide master plan, and to come up with a way to support both individual localities and some of that regional dialogue that you're alluding to, because it is really important. If I could just say one more thing, that is that we are exploring the possibility of doing a regional study with the Army Corps that would cover the whole peninsula, and that would include all of the other localities, with Hampton as the lead kind of local sponsor. Nothing concrete yet, but that is something we are hoping to do eventually.
So back to the seawalls. You mentioned the Hampton River as one example where they're thinking about it. And again, the cooperation thing comes into play. So if downtown raises a seawall, some properties owned by residents will have varying levels of seawall. So how does that work? How would you work, like trying to get certain seawalls to a certain height around there, dealing with residents and public property?
Yeah, so I think firstly, we would need to go through a really involved and extensive public engagement process for any seawall that would be installed on private property. And that's not currently something that we are contemplating doing. That would be the result probably of this Army Corps study that I was mentioning. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work that Norfolk is doing to build their seawall around downtown. Which is very expensive and time consuming for them. But that's the path they've decided to take, and I would argue perhaps they need it. So I think to answer your question, it would be a long and involved dialogue with every individual property owner that was going to be impacted, and they would have to agree to that seawall. And at the present time, we're not contemplating doing that installation on privately owned property.
You showed one of your slides of the road by Home Depot that
Yes.
you're going to raise up to 5 feet.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a trench along one side of that road.
Mm-hmm.
And there are I don't know, are they apartments, condos?
Townhomes. Mm-hmm.
What do you do when you raise the road for conserving the land on the side there where the condos are?
Mm-hmm.
That's very low lying, and that sort of backs up to that creek, right?
Mm-hmm.
So raising the road is one issue, but conserving the land for the people that live along there, how do you do that? How do you consider that?
Yeah, so I think in any project, of course, there's always trade-offs, and in this particular case, I think raising the road 5 feet is not something that is happening in that particular location. That amount of raising there will actually be a lot less. Mm-hmm. And the amount that's being raised is more prominent on the southern side of that. So I think it's the eastbound headed lanes where it's much lower than the other side. So on the side where those townhomes are, it's actually being raised a lot less because the road is just already higher. In any project where we're considering a road raising, we always have to consider those kind of impacts and what the roadway itself, how that will impact. And in this particular case, all the drainage falling on that roadway will be funneled to the center because of the angle of the roads, and then drained into, most of it, I think, going into the Lake Hampton, that big stormwater pond that's already in that area where we're adding more storage capacity through the Lake Hampton project. But it's a good question. There's always going to be cases where, you want to preserve access and the ability to get in and out of a neighborhood safely by perhaps doing a road raising, but then you've got neighbors on either side of that road, and how does that road raising impact them, their driveways? What's the cost of doing that versus the benefit of getting people in and out, of perhaps a much larger area? And this is getting to those, like I said, not everything's going to be rosy. A lot of these conversations are going to be really difficult, and there are going to be benefits and costs to be weighed. I think that's one example of them.
I have two questions. The first one is, when will these 3 projects begin, and when will they end? And then the second question is, are there any programs federal or whatever, for those of us who have homes that are becoming wetlands and purchasing private property, buying us out so that we can move somewhere drier?
Yeah, great questions. So for the Big Bethel Blueway and the Lake Hampton projects, we are really, really hoping that we can get those projects out to bid in the next couple of months. So we are pretty much finished with the designs, and by going out to bid, I mean putting out a request for proposals to hire a construction firm to actually build the projects. That process could take 3 to 6 months to complete, and then after that, of course, there's the actual construction. So it will be several years now until those projects are actually completed. The North Armistead project will probably take a bit longer for a variety of reasons, including federal funding that we're receiving, hopefully, fingers crossed, for the project, which will tend to delay things even further, but we're getting a huge, hopefully some lump of money from another source, which would be great. So that one wouldn't start for a couple of years yet in terms of construction, and then after that would take, again, several years to actually finish with all of the construction. The second part of your question was about assistance to homeowners. The city does have a home elevation assistance program through our emergency management team. I'm not aware of any specific programs within the City of Hampton at the present that offer city funding for acquisition. I think you can get in touch with the emergency management team to get onto a list for FEMA funding, for federal FEMA funding for that. But the city does not currently have an acquisition program ourselves. That's the FEMA, that's the federal funding, is the Federal Emergency Management Agency funding. So I would recommend contacting the emergency management team who can help you get in touch with the right resources. And I can connect with you after.
My question was sort of along those lines as well. When you did the overlay of the percentage of people in the different areas that are at or below the poverty level, I wonder how much serious discussion has there been in the city about the fact that many of the lowest lying areas are inhabited by people who are not going to be able to afford to do anything on their own, and that mitigation in 50 years is going to do nothing for them because they'll be underwater. So is there a discussion about not just trying to save the property, but have a realistic discussion that some areas of the city are not going to be inhabitable, and what do you do with the people who live there now?
Yeah, I think we are eager to have that conversation with the community as part of the community plan process. So as we're thinking about that long-range vision over the next 20 years, we're rewriting our plan for the whole community for the next 20 years. I think there are a lot of staff and city leadership, myself included, that really hope that we can have that kind of tough conversation with the community as part of that planning process of, this is the reality that we expect to see happening, and what do we do about it? Those are, again, the difficult decisions, and I think it really needs to be a values-driven and a community-engaged dialogue, and I think this community plan process really offers that opportunity to have that conversation. But I would say I don't think we've fully had the conversation yet, as you probably know.
Looking a little bit farther in the future, the land is going down here for 3-4 different reasons, and the sea is rising. The storms, for other climate reasons, are getting a bit more intense, to a lot more intense. Norfolk is buying up some of the waterfront property to turn it back into the salt marsh. Norfolk tried raising houses. Then they said, well, then we got to raise roads. Then we got to raise utilities. And they finally gave up and said, no, we can't afford this. The experience with seawalls and so forth is that over a longer distance, like decades, not a few years, they don't work for a lot of reasons. They're too expensive, they just don't stay. The UK has decided that the only real way to handle this, as the positive feedbacks kick in, and the methane is going up because it's coming out of the tundra and the ocean, and Now, the Arctic is rising in temperature not twice as fast as the rest of the planet, but 3 times as fast as the rest of the planet. So there's methane and CO2 coming out of the oceans, coming out of the tundra. So all of this is going to accelerate 3 feet by 2050, 6 to 7 feet or more by 2100. The UK has decided retreat is the only reasonable way, for the farther future, unless we get smart and try to, counter our what is actually causing this.
Right.
And there's another 60 to 80 years already baked in from what we've done so far.
Thank you. That was a great overview of the challenge. I agree with everything you said. Anything else?
All right, any more questions for Carolyn? Well, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Carolyn, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I will say that the questions were well placed and more numerous than we're used to. So I'm glad to see a crowd so engaged with the topic. So thank you very much. And
Thank
remember
you all.
those things that we mentioned at the very start of the meeting. We're going to be here for you to come back and join us for other activities. So thanks again.